It exploded. Elias Harrow sat perfectly still as the shards showered his red polo shirt. At 40 years old, Harrow was a man in his absolute prime, yet he didn't raise a finger to resist. He didn't even flinch when Deputy Briggs reached through the jagged frame, gripped him by the throat, and dragged him out into the suffocating heat of Route 9. "You think you're a lawyer, boy?" Briggs spat, his face inches from Harrow's. "You think quoting cases at me makes you special? You're just another piece of trash in my county." Briggs slammed him against the trunk of the car. The metal groaned under the force. Most men Harrow's age would be fighting for their lives or begging for a break. But as the handcuffs clicked onto his left wrist, Elias Harrow's eyes remained icy. He wasn't looking at the deputy's face. He was staring at the deputy's boots. He wasn't looking for a way to run. He was looking for a target. With a sudden, violent snap of his hips, Harrow drove his heel into the deputy's shin. The sound of the impact was sickeningly clear on the dash cam. Briggs roared in agony. He spun Harrow around and tackled him into the dirt, raining punches down on a man who was clearly capable of fighting back, yet chose to take every hit. "Assault!" Briggs screamed into his radio. "Officer needs assistance! He attacked me! I'm charging him with aggravated felony assault!" As his face was pressed into the gravel and blood began to leak from his lip, Elias Harrow did something that should have terrified the deputy. He smiled. Because in that moment, Elias Harrow hadn't just committed a crime. He had just triggered a legal landmine. To understand why a 40-year-old man in his peak would intentionally assault a police officer, you have to understand the town of Amos. It was a legal black hole. Sheriff Miller and his brother, the local magistrate, had turned the county into a private ATM. They targeted outsiders, seized their property under civil forfeiture, and used the local court to bury any complaints. If you were arrested for a misdemeanor in Amos, you stayed in Amos. The evidence would vanish, the body cams would fail, and you would be forced into a plea deal that stripped you of your rights and your money. Elias Harrow knew this better than anyone. 5 years ago, he was a rising star, the youngest state judge in the history of the circuit. The Millers had framed him, stripped him of his gavel, and ruined his life just as his career was taking off. They mutilated the evidence so thoroughly that no court would hear his appeal. They thought they had broken him before he could become a real threat. But Harrow had spent the last 5 years living in the shadows of Amos, surrounded by law books and police scanners. He realized the Millers had one weakness: jurisdiction. As long as a crime was minor, the Millers owned the outcome. But a Class A felony, specifically one involving a former judicial officer, triggered a mandatory transfer to federal court. Harrow knew he couldn't sue them from the outside. He had to destroy them from the inside. He didn't need a lawyer. He needed to be the defendant in a courtroom the Millers couldn't touch. He needed a federal judge to see what was happening in Amos County, and the only way to get to that courtroom was to commit a violent felony on camera. Harrow had chosen Deputy Briggs specifically. Briggs was the muscle, a man with a hair-trigger temper and a history of excessive force that the sheriff had spent years hiding. The routine arrest started when Harrow drove exactly 2 miles under the speed limit. In a town that survives on traffic fines, driving perfectly is a provocation. When Briggs pulled him over, Harrow was ready. He rolled the window down only 2 inches. He refused to step out. He quoted the state officer's field manual verbatim, correcting Briggs's grammar and challenging his probable cause. Harrow wasn't being difficult. He was being an architect. He was building a pressure cooker. He knew that if he just sat there, Briggs would eventually break. When the window was smashed and the struggle began, Harrow waited for the exact moment Briggs touched him. The law states that you cannot use force to resist a lawful arrest, but Harrow knew that if he provoked Briggs into an unlawful use of force first, his assault would become a matter of federal record, not just a local scuffle. The kick to the shin was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a technical battery. It was just enough to justify the aggravated assault charge the sheriff was dying to use against him to settle an old score. In the Amos County Jail, Sheriff Miller walked up to Harrow's cell. He was beaming. "You're done, Elias," the sheriff said. "I've got the video. I've got the broken skin on my deputy's leg. We're charging you with the highest felony on the books. You're going to rot for the next 20 years. "Are you sure about that, Jim?" Harrow asked, his voice calm as he stood up from the bench, his height and physical presence making the sheriff take a half step back. "You might want to check the filing requirements for a Class A felony involving a former state judge." The sheriff's smile vanished. He ran to his office and grabbed the statute book. His heart sank. By charging a man of Harrow's former status with a top-tier felony instead of a simple misdemeanor, he had inadvertently triggered a federal venue change. Because the crime was aggravated and the defendant was a protected judicial figure under state law, the local magistrate had no authority to hold him. The case was automatically moved to the United States District Court, 3 hours away in the city. The sheriff tried to lower the charges, but it was too late. The paperwork was already in the digital system. The paper trail had left Amos County. 2 weeks later, in the sterile brilliance of a federal courtroom, the prosecution played the dashcam footage. They thought the video of the kick was their smoking gun. But as Elias Harrow stood up, he wasn't looking for mercy. He was looking for a receipt. "Your Honor," Harrow said, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who still owned the room. "I admit to the strike, but under the Federal Victim Compensation Act, this wasn't an assault. It was a recovery of evidence." He dropped a heavy black binder onto the table. It didn't just contain the sheriff's crimes. It contained the proof that 5 years ago, this same department had mutilated evidence to steal his career. Because that original conviction was now proven to be a result of state-sponsored fraud, Harrow held a unique legal status, mandatory restitution. Under a rare clean slate provision for wrongly convicted judicial officers, Harrow had preemptive immunity for actions taken to expose the original fraud. He hadn't just kicked a cop. He had legally breached a corrupt system to serve a federal subpoena that the sheriff had been dodging for years. The federal judge didn't just stay the charges, he dismissed them with prejudice. He ruled that the assault was a direct result of the sheriff's ongoing criminal conspiracy against Harrow. By the next morning, the tables had turned. The FBI moved in, and the Millers were let out in the very handcuffs they had used on Harrow. But the real victory was the civil settlement. Because of those 5 lost years and the bridge of corruption Harrow had just exposed, the county was ordered to pay a multi-million-dollar compensation package. Elias Harrow walked down the courthouse steps, adjusting his red shirt. He didn't just get his reputation back, he had turned a 5-year nightmare into a lifetime of wealth and freedom. He hadn't just beaten the arrest, he had made the police pay for every second of his time. Elias Harrow walked down the courthouse steps, but he didn't stop for the flashbulbs. He didn't give the reporters a quote. At 40 years old, he moved with a predatory stillness, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the street. He knew that when you cut the head off a snake, the body still thrashes, and Sheriff Jim Miller was thrashing. He reached the 3rd level of the concrete parking garage, where the air was cold and smelled of damp oil. The silence was too thick. Harrow stopped 10 feet from his car, his hand hovering near his pocket. He didn't reach for his keys. He reached for a small black tablet. On the screen, a red dot was moving. "I knew you couldn't help yourself, Jim," Harrow whispered to the empty air. He didn't get into his car. Instead, he walked toward the edge of the garage, looking down at the street below. A black SUV with tinted windows was idling near the exit. It didn't have plates. In Amos County, that SUV was a symbol of terror. Here in the city, it was a target. Harrow didn't run. He took the stairs, moving with a calculated rhythm. He wanted to be seen. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his red shirt a deliberate beacon against the gray concrete. The SUV lurched forward. This is where the tension spikes. The viewer expects a high-speed chase, but Harrow is on foot. He ducks into a narrow, brick-lined alleyway, a kill box for anyone following. The SUV screeches to a halt at the mouth of the alley. The doors fly open. Jim Miller and Deputy Briggs step out. They aren't in uniform. They look like hired muscle. Miller is holding a heavy service pistol. Briggs has a tactical baton. They think they've caught him in a dead end. "You think that mandatory restitution protects you back here, Elias?" Miller hissed, his voice bouncing off the brick walls. "The feds are busy processing our paperwork at the station. It'll take them an hour to realize we walked out the back door. That's an hour I'm going to spend making sure you never cash that check." Harrow stood at the end of the alley, his back to a locked steel door. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored. "Jim, you always were a terrible student of procedure," Harrow said, checking his watch. "You think you walked out the back door? I opened that door for you." The confusion on Miller's face is the first hook of the finale. "What are you talking about?" Miller growled, leveling the gun at Harrow's chest. "The Federal Victim Compensation Act isn't just about money, Jim," Harrow said, taking a slow, measured step forward. "It grants the victim, me, the right to protective surveillance during the transition of power. Every phone call you made from that holding cell was recorded. Every friend you asked to help you escape was a federal informant." Harrow pointed to the brick wall above them. Nestled in the masonry was a small, high-definition camera with a glowing blue ring. "This isn't an alley, Jim. It's a soundstage. And you just gave the most incriminating performance of your life." Briggs looked back at the SUV, his eyes wide with panic. "Sheriff, we gotta go, now!" "Go where?" Harrow asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "I own the company that manages this entire block. I bought it with the first installment of my settlement. You aren't on public property. You are trespassing on my private estate. And in this state, I have the right to use any means necessary to protect my property from armed intruders." In the distance, the low growl of high-performance engines screamed toward the alley. Black SUVs, real ones this time, swerved around the corner, blocking the exit. Blue and red lights reflected off the brick, turning the alley into a strobe-lit nightmare for the two corrupt cops. "You didn't just lose your career today, Jim," Harrow continued, now standing only 5 feet from the barrel of Miller's gun. "By bringing that weapon here, you just violated the terms of your federal indictment. You just turned a 10-year sentence into a life term without parole. I didn't even have to kick you this time. You did it to yourself." Miller's hand shook. The power dynamic had completely flipped. He was the one in the cage now, and Elias was the one holding the keys. "Drop it, Jim!" a voice boomed from a megaphone. Federal marshals swarmed the alley, their boots thundering on the pavement. They pinned Miller and Briggs to the ground, the very gravel they had once shoved Harrow's face into now, cutting into their own cheeks. Elias Harrow didn't stay to watch the booking. He turned to the steel door behind him, pulled out a key card and swiped it. The door hissed open into a luxury lobby. As he stepped inside, he paused and looked back at the chaos. He adjusted his red shirt, smoothed his hair, and looked at the sheriff one last time. "Justice isn't just served, Jim," Harrow said, his voice cold and final. "It's collected with interest." Elias Harrow spent 5 years in the shadows just to land that one perfect strike. He lost his career, but he won his freedom. Was he a genius for playing the system, or did he go too far by putting hands on a deputy? Let me know in the comments if you think the kick was justified. And if you want to see more stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It's the only way to make sure you never miss a checkmate.